And welcome everyone to the Shitlord Preachers podcast. This is episode 43. Another great episode, of course, on our weekly podcast. My name is Amos Joseph here in Minnesota, joined by my co-host, Brook Potter, who's in the UK. How's it going today, Brook?
It's not as cold as I thought it was going to be. Like this place can't make up its mind on whether it's snowing or if it's raining or if we're going to have great sunshine. I'm actually wearing a leather jacket today, which is pretty cool. This is my uncle's, so, hi, uncle. But yeah, it's going well, man. It was always good to be back on the show. We're on, 44 episodes? Is that right?
43.
43.
43.
Yeah.
So for those of us who are joining us for the first time, either on our live stream here or on the podcasting platforms, Shitlord Preachers is basically Brook and myself, both former preachers, now reformed shitlords, basically come together and we have social commentary, social, cultural, and as well as political commentary. And we have these conversations with each other as well as with other guests. Today, we actually have a really, really special guest, I'd say, a Dr. Kirk Meighoo who's a doctor of political science. How's it going today, Kirk?
Good. It's a pleasure to be here. Glad to be on your podcast.
Awesome. Now, real quick, you're a doctor of political science, and you gave us a little bit of what that all entails. Where did you get your degree in political science?
It was at the University of Hull in the UK, and in the UK they call it politics. So the PhD is technically in politics, and a famous thing in the UK is PPE. That's politics, philosophy, and economics. I didn't do PPE. I was politics, and I was Wilberforce Scholar, and that is. In Hull, William Wilberforce was the MP in the 19th century who piloted the abolition of slavery bill. He was a huge abolitionist campaigner, and so I was I was funded by the university and the Commonwealth. There's a Commonwealth committee and so forth. So I was their scholar there for 2-3 years, I think it was. And so it was a great experience being up there in the north of England. In fact, very interestingly, when people from outside of England, the West Indies, but anywhere else, you think of England, they think of London, right? And London is not England, right? London is London, right? And so I went. Not even people in England go to Hull. They make fun of Hull. Hull is not even along the main M1 motorway going up to Edinburgh or whatever. You have to want to go to Hull if you're going to go to Hull. It's like going to the States for the first time and you're in Peoria or something. It's like, no, I wanted New York. What the hell? And I was like, oh my God, Hull. I didn't even want to go to England, to be honest. I was like, oh God, of all the places, and not even London. But let me tell you, it was an amazing experience being there, and I really got to know and love England. England. It was English. It was great. And then, because of the history of England, there's surprising ties all over the place with the world. Like the ports in Liverpool and Hull and of course, Bristol and stuff in the south. There are just amazing historical connections between the places. And there was an amazing historical connection up in Hull with, some of the greatest West Indian thinkers who I was very much proud to be, part of that lineage there, from C.L.R. James and Eric Williams. And they're amazing historians of slavery and empire there. So it was amazing. It was amazing.
I mean, just on a side note, in case anybody hasn't figured this out, Kirk is actually from my home country of Trinidad and Tobago, which we will get to eventually. So, I mean, you were educated in the UK, but where were you born? Where were you raised before you made it to England?
Yeah, actually, I was born in the United States, but I never lived there. I was born in 1968. And so when I say never lived there, I mean, it was like I was a month old when I left, right? So I literally mean I never really lived there. And it wasn't an anchor baby thing. That wasn't a thing at the time in 1968, as far as I'm aware. But what it was is that my dad was utterly terrified. 1968, I was born at the end, right? And Martin Luther King was assassinated that year. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated that year. They were in Vietnam. You know, he was just this young Trini boy, and he didn't know if he was going to be drafted to Vietnam, and he was frightened as hell. Let's put it that way. And so he had a friend in Canada, and so they went to Canada. And I found myself, I suppose, when I think about it in a historical context, we were probably pioneers of what I now call Trinidad colonies out, right? I think there are Trinidad colonies in Toronto,
yes,
in London, in
New
Miami,
York.
and New York.
Yeah.
And the way to identify a Trinidad colony is if they have a carnival. So if there's a carnival, so there's the Brooklyn Carnival, there's Miami Carnival, there's Notting Hill Carnival, and there's Caravana. And what I mean by a colony is that within that space, like, so my best friends were Trinidadian, my parents' best friends were Trinidadian. I had a Trinidadian accent, which the school had to send me to speech class to take out of me. You know, the food we ate, all these things. And when I decided to go back to Trinidad to live, that was in 1990. I was 21 at the time, and it was actually during the coup. They were the only Islamic coup in the Western Hemisphere in Trinidad and Tobago. I don't know if we should be proud of that or not, but that's a fact.
It's something. It's something.
And I went there at that time, but it was quite amazing. Because although Trinidad is a small place, it is incredibly diverse. And
yes.
Like, let's say the differences between North and South are, you know, there are many differences between North, Central, South, between the East and all these sorts of things. But my family's from South Trinidad, and in Toronto, most of the migrants are from South.
Correct.
I think in New York, most of the migrants are from North. Right?
Yes.
These are interesting kind of differences in the colonies. Let's put it that way, because I think we need a colonial policy. But anyway, so I was in north of Trinidad, where my parents have no idea about, and I was in, you know, what are considered the worst areas, which is like the ghetto area in the Beetham, Laventille. So if people know Trinidad, they'll know what I mean by that. But that's like, I don't know, South Central LA. You know, if Los
in
Angeles,
the 90s,
yeah, in the 90s, right, exactly, yeah. Right, or the reputation Harlem used to have before, and stuff like that, right? So I was there, and so even people from the south of Trinidad who lived in Trinidad all their life, that's a totally strange place. And anyway, so I was up there, and I remember foods that I grew up eating in the Trinidad colony as normal Trinidad food. And the people, the Trinidadians who were born, bred, grew up in Trinidad, they had no idea about these things. And I had to be teaching them about Trinidad culture, you know, because it's quite amazing. Things like Trini to the Bone, a very famous song, which has been sort of adopted as kind of an unofficial Trinidadian national anthem. It was written by a Calypsonian in Toronto.
That's right. It was David Rudder.
That's right. David Rudder wrote it after he left, and he lived in Toronto, and then everybody in Trinidad adopts it as a sort of patriotic song. I don't know if he's purposely being ironic because he had some bad things to say when he left. But yeah, so but the thing is that the culture is actually reproduced in these colonies, because it's reached such a mass that it reproduces itself. And then you have all the huge amount of connections, academic connections, family connections, business connections, a network of, you know, things like roti shops and West Indian groceries and carnival bands. And there's an amazing traffic of goods, peoples, ideas,
food, music,
exactly, culture, that really
it goes around the world.
And it expands the boundaries of where the nation starts or ends, really, you know. So anyways, but I found myself going back to Trinidad and committing myself to Trinidad, and it's actually, you know, I became a very strong nationalist, and that's really a huge reason why I left Canada too, because I said, you know, that's not my country. Wow. And so, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So a Trinidad nationalist, you'd say?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, this is our country. Yeah.
Right, right. Now, just real quick before we get into that, because I know that's kind of our topic we'll be touching on today, but everyone who's joining us, Kirk actually has his own podcast, which is a big part too, where we love to have him on because not only does he have a lot of great insight, but also just your experience with the political arena, but also you have a podcast. Tell us a little bit about that. What is it? The Independent Thought and Freedom. There we go.
Yeah, yeah, and I had Brook on. We haven't published that interview yet, but Brook was a guest on Independent Thought and Freedom.
It was a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun.
Yeah, we did. I'm glad you thought so. I certainly did, and I think the listeners would think so as well.
Now, what inspired you to start that podcast then?
Right. Actually, I have a television program here in Trinidad and Tobago. Called Current Issues with Dr. Kirk Meighoo, and that's a weekly thing. Podcasting, it was a great way for me to sort of expand the topics that I get to deal with, for me to reconnect with a lot of people on the outside, and to start to discuss issues on a global scale, while not you see, one of the things about being in Trinidad and Tobago is that we're part of Western society and yet marginal to it at the same time. But we have had some great thinkers like C.L.R. James, Eric Williams, V.S. Naipaul. Those are our three greatest. But there are others, but those are our three greatest. And they've always engaged the world at the highest levels. And as Trinidadians, right? So it's not like they left and they went to America and then they just started talking about whatever, and did not integrate their Trinidad past. And the thing is, when you read any one of them, whether it be Williams talking about capitalism and slavery in the British Empire, or C.L.R. James talking about world development, or V.S. Naipaul talking about, I suppose, the state of the world, especially after the end of colonialism. They definitely bring the experience of Trinidad and Tobago, Trinidad in particular, to that, because you see, we are not. I had to actually write a letter to the Boston Globe the other day. They had an article about
natural gas.
Right. Natural gas being imported from Trinidad, from this lonely, remote island of Trinidad or something. And they made it seem like, we were all living in trees, and somehow there's this mysterious fuel that went up to the States, and we were just these innocent natives that were being exploited by the global fossil fuel industry, which is, and it just fits into this typical patronizing left-wing narrative. And I wrote to them to say, listen, they're from Boston, and I said, you guys should know that the wealth of Boston was built on the whole triangular trade that involved the West Indies. The molasses that was produced here went up to the Boston distilleries, and you produced your alcohol, your rum, etc. from there, and then along with the manufactured goods from London, went to Africa. You purchased slaves from the slave traders in Africa, and then you took them to the West Indies where the molasses was made, and this was what they call triangular trade, probably a bit more of a circle, but and at each leg of that journey, tons of money was made in the shipping and price differentials and arbitrage and all sorts of stuff, and that and so Boston was built off that. Trinidad and Tobago has the oldest oil industry in the world. There's a contest for somewhere else in the States, but okay, if we're the second oldest, it's still a claim to make. I believe we're the oldest, though. But
nationalist.
Yes, ready to go to war for that. And yeah, so I was just telling them, that, and we are not disconnected from the world. And as C.L.R. James himself said, at the beginning of the world system, the West Indies were there. In fact, we were part of the world system the modern world system way before many places in Europe. The West Indies is where you had for the first time a huge labor force organized on an industrial scale, right? So this is before the Industrial Revolution, right? So the huge slave plantations that existed here organized human beings industrially in a process of production for export, for a global commodity, and they would import everything. We didn't make anything for ourselves here, right? So everything was imported, down to the labor, down to the people. And so we were part of this global import-export foreign investment system, which defines the modern world system, you know, for hundreds of years. But we also illustrate the dark side of modernity, right? So we have, you know, the insights into the underside of the modern world as well. And, you know, and all these people, James, Williams, Naipaul, brought this to bear in their understanding and interpretation of what's going on in the world. I've always been inspired by those men. I just love them. I've ever since a teenager, I'm just absorbing all this stuff, and I've always, you know, idolized them. And one of the things I found in Trinidad and Tobago is that we don't have these kind of intellectuals engaging the world from, you know, as a Trinidadian, not erasing your past and going to Oxford and then whatever and neglecting your past, but as Trinidadian. So it's kind of taking up that mantle, because the name Independent Thought and Freedom comes from another person who I love and admire deeply, and who I was personally connected to, is Lloyd Best. And in 1965, now he's not as well known globally, but certainly he's towering here in Trinidad and Tobago. And he wrote a seminal essay in 1965 called Independent Thought and Freedom, and Caribbean Freedom, Independent Thought and Caribbean Freedom. And it was about how, that was during the days of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis just happened in '62. It was 3 years later. Our independence in Trinidad and Tobago and also Jamaica happened in '62. And people were kind of trying to line themselves up on the Soviet side or the American side. Should we be with the West, or should we be with the anti-colonial socialists? And Lloyd Best said, look, none of them are for us. We have to be for ourselves. We're independent. We can't look for saviors outside. We have to think of our own problems in our own way and understand our own societies on our own terms, develop our own language, our own concepts. And he spent his life, he died in 2007. He spent his life doing these things, getting involved politically, writing, putting out magazines. And so I took from him, I just took out the Caribbean part because it's the world I want to engage. He was very much a nationalist and planted everything at home, and that, so his discourse was primarily for the Caribbean, and I totally respect and understand what he was doing, but I want to sort of reconnect to the world. So that's the long story of why I started the podcast.
Excellent. We have a mutual friend, Kirk. He's watching in silence, but he does give his regards. He goes. I interviewed him on my podcast. People would know him as Specular Effect. But
great, nice.
Thanks for tuning in. So I mean, the podcasting thing is fantastic, and I always appreciated you wanting to preserve the Caribbean culture in reaching out to the world. So I mean, who inspired you? I mean, you've listed these guys. Right, but now the technical side of it, like, because you already have a show, you've also written, you're an author.
Yeah,
I know you've been involved in the political process and stuff like that. But how did you get into the podcasting side of things?
Right. I mean, the internet's an amazing place, and there's so, just discover things all the time. And now, now my reading of a physical book, that time is now shrinking infinitesimally, and I'm just online all the time.
Are you a Kindle reader? My girlfriend would not be pleased.
Yeah, no, actually not. I don't prefer Kindles to books.
Okay, fair enough.
It's just that the things you get online instantaneously all the time, and the videos and the articles and all the historical stuff, even things I lived through in the 80s that I had no idea. And now we're discovering, all these things. Like, for instance, I liked Bill Clinton in the 1990s. You know, I really did. And now, sort of looking back, sort of every single problem in today's world can be traced right back to Bill Clinton, from Glass-Steagall to the whole NATO Russian problem. I mean, you know, from economics to politics, even the things of like the security state and you know, like the Waco, Texas thing. And I mean, it all goes back to the Clintons. It's something else. But yeah, so I've been consuming all this content online and you know, getting into some of the weird dark corners of the internet. and they have these you know, podcasts and stuff, and going on for like 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. I just found this stuff amazing, that there was this appetite for this kind of discussion, because every time you're reading, people's attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. And now, you know, they say a movie frame used to be 20 seconds, now it has to be 7, and it has to go down to 3, and all this kind of stuff. And they're saying people are getting dumber and dumber, shorter and shorter stuff. But these podcasts are like, it's totally proving it wrong, because I've seen an 8-hour podcast. Maybe it was like 3 or 4 guys, people coming in and out, you know, and they're talking about obscure stuff, obscure topics that I'd never think would have a wide audience or listenership. And you know, it's just it's intellectually exciting. You know, so what's going on in the internet, in this, you know, podcasting sphere. And then
that's what connected with you. You wanted to get involved in that.
Yeah. And then, you know, Brian Rose from London Real, you know, he's had some good guests on and stuff. And I was actually intrigued when he had David Icke on, right? And I said, let's see how he handles David Icke, because, you know, Icke, he's out there, of course, the reptilian stuff. And but you know, he's also very interesting. So that stuff was really interesting. And then Brian had a course on how to launch your own podcast and stuff. I said, let me do it. And so I took the course and I launched it in 8 weeks. Well, actually, it was like 4 weeks, as you said. So, and in fact, because of that experience too, I'm actually going to launch my own course. Hopefully in 2 weeks, it'll be out live, where if people want to start their own podcast and learn from me, I'll take them through the exact steps I did. And because I love this space here on the internet that people are making for themselves and talking about things that the mainstream media won't talk about, and also in a sort of depth that is just not possible on other platforms, neither radio, neither TV, because this is totally open. You know, it's not like you have to do it in a 15-minute segment, then go for a commercial break, and then another 15. Like even my TV shows like that. I have to have a short little interview, and then you have a little break, and then another thing. And you can't get into the depth that I get into in my podcast. So that's why I did it on.
I mean, I think that's very much why this has taken off, in the sense, as you've done television, I've done television. You know, you have to get there a couple hours early. You spend time in makeup, and you get, well, in your case, you have an entire show, which is what, half an hour to an hour? I don't know.
Half an hour. Mm-hmm.
Half an hour. And then you got 2 commercial breaks. So you really got like 20 minutes.
Correct.
After you do your introductions and stuff. And that's a whole day.
That's right.
Right? Like when I used to, I had a couple appearances on TV, and it was literally a whole day for a 15-minute spot. And
that's right. You
can't do much. So I'm very excited for your project. And of course, we wish all our listeners to join with his podcast and let's get a good relationship going.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm glad to hook up with you guys and other podcasters who I think, you know, are pushing boundaries, right? I love that. I love that about this whole space, and I want to be very much part of that as well, you know? So I look forward to developing the relationship.
Now, I was just looking through here. Now, you started the podcast back in like early December, right?
Correct.
Is that correct? Now, I've seen you've had a few guests, Brook included. What would you say are like some of the most interesting guests you've had so far?
Let's see. I mean, I've had 9 in-depth interviews so far, right? So it's not like I don't want to, basically choose among the limited thing, but because everybody really has their own interest. But one of the things about my first guest, which was the former Prime Minister Bastio Pandey, I mean, he's been interviewed a lot, and I mean, we had basically almost a 3-hour interview, which I had to cut up into pieces. And I mean, I know for sure that he's never said any of this stuff ever anywhere before. And I mean, he's told me that, wow, you get me thinking of and remembering stuff that I've never, thought of or spoken about before. So, so I think I really got some historical gems there. And then Michael Rechtenwald, who is the anti-PC prof from New York University, wrote Springtime for Snowflakes. And his upcoming book is called The Google Archipelago. Brilliant title. And about, censorship and SJWs and stuff like that. We had a really great interview. He told me afterward that, this is the best interview he's ever done, in terms of the stuff he's been talking about. He's been on Tucker Carlson, he's been on, Fox and Friends, he's been on Bill O'Reilly, he's been on all these shows, and he's regularly appearing on them. And so that's a great compliment. I think we got into some really good stuff there on that. Just a couple of weeks ago, I did an interview with an author, Christopher McIntosh, and the topic might seem off base. It was about paganism, European paganism, and his journey into that. He's an author about the Western esoteric tradition, so things like Rosicrucians and those kind of secret societies, and then paganism, which they're two different things, although if you're not into it, you might think it's the same type of thing. But it's not. And we had because you see a lot of the sort of nationalists, especially the European nationalists, were very much into their pre-Christian heritage. And so there's a lot of relationship, and a lot of the alt-right and the white nationalists and of today, look very much to these ancient traditions, and so there's a lot of tie up there. And so we had great conversations there. And one of the sad things actually about that was that he asked for a little bit to be cut out of the interview, and I was really kind of
2 minds.
I didn't want to. I hate censorship in general, and I thought, it's kind of cowardly in a sense. But then when I asked him what he wanted to be cut out, right, and he told me what section, I said the whole section. He said no, just this one little part here. And when he told me, and I'm not going to tell you because I want to,
of course,
yeah, when he told me the little part he wanted to be cut out, then I realized why he did it, right? And it's not the expected Aryan Nazi thing. It's not that, right? It's something else. And I realized, oh yeah, in the EU, you can be prosecuted for thinking the wrong thoughts, for saying this stuff. I said, my God. So I wanted to protect it, and he's in Germany, right? So and they're really bad out in Germany, so I wanted to protect him from that, And I was saying, and then I had a reflection that, in the Caribbean, we're so free. We can talk about these things, about like heritage, about things like about ethnicity, freely spoken of in the West Indies.
Very true.
And things like gender, all politically correct incorrect opinions are mainstream here. So we could talk about these issues with a freedom here that is just not possible in the so-called free world,
Yeah, Europe and the UK especially, which has been such a tragedy.
Oh yeah, I read about this guy who tweeted a limerick. Correct. That suggested, you're aware, that suggested that trans women are not women. and the voice of the limerick person. I don't know if the writer is a man or woman, but certainly the voice of the limerick is a woman.
It was a woman who wrote it, yeah.
Yeah, and so a woman saying a trans woman is not a woman. And he retweeted that, and the police went and questioned him to find out about his thinking process.
Yeah. I mean, we are living in the Orwellian nightmare of 1984.
Yeah, Airstrip 1.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. But I mean, we wanted to get into the whole nationalist discussion. And it's a controversial one.
Yeah, very much. Yeah.
So maybe we could start with, how would you define, what is your definition of a nationalist?
Yeah. I mean, a nationalism, well, a nationalist sort of believes believes he is part of a group of people, a nation, and that and he believes there's such thing as a people, and he's part of it. I think it's simply that, and that simple idea is being attacked violently. Just like, it's just as simple as saying, there's a difference between a man and a woman, and that is being attacked violently. I don't think it's anything much greater than that, what I mean. Now, of course, if you ask an academic on the left who's critical of nationalism, they're going to get into some long, convoluted thing because they want to open the door to say how it leads to Nazism and the Holocaust, right? So they inevitably want to make a line straight from nationalism to the killing of 6 million Jews. It's which I think is totally ridiculous, because I mean, but this sort of mind game is being played on Europe and and the European, America, Canada, Australia, right? So the white Commonwealth countries, it's basically white countries of the world that are being, made guilty about having nationalist feelings. Because I assure you that everywhere else in the world, people are nationalists. Every single country in the world outside of that sphere, there's nothing unusual about being nationalist, and that all independence movements are motivated by nationalism, and that you have the right to self-determination, and you should control your own country. I guess that's part of the definition too. You have the right to self-determination, being part of this people.
If I could, I'm just to clear now, I'm not going to try to play on some long definition, but my understanding, and then tell me if you think you agree on this, that the difference between patriotism and nationalism, I'd say maybe a patriot is someone who is proud and stands for the principles by which their country was founded upon, whereas a nationalism goes further and identifies with the land and the people of where they're at. So a patriot might not be nationalistic because they might not agree with something the government is doing. Like I consider myself a libertarian, but I'm patriotic about the U.S., but I might not agree with certain things that the U.S. government act, in their interest, whereas a nationalist might be more with that.
Yeah, I totally understand the distinction you're trying to get at, and it's a valid one. Because nationalism, you can have right-wing nationalism, you can have left-wing nationalism. You could have nationalism that is sort of more libertarian to some degree, I suppose, and then some that's more right-wing authoritarian, right? And so definitely the content of nationalism is open, but I think I don't think there's so much of a difference between patriotism and nationalism. I think that that there might be forms of nationalism that patriots would not agree with, right? So if there is a sort of a authoritarian nationalism, let me put it that way, where they compel people, and it's very sort of government dominated.
Worship the state.
Exactly. So you could be a nationalist, but not be, a state worshiper, and not be a big government person, right? And I think, and this is one of the things about nationalism, that it does come from, I'm using old-fashioned language here, but the spirit and soul of a people, right? And that Chinese nationalism and American nationalism and Russian nationalism necessarily will have different content, and British nationalism as well, English nationalism, I should say. It's really English and Scottish nationalism and Irish nationalism rather than British nationalism, and that they would each have their own, ideals, historical ideals that may change over time, that may have flexibility and all this sort of stuff. But just as, there are national characters. I mean, there are people who will say there's no difference between anybody, we're all the same, but I don't agree. Although there are, every individual is different, but there are, statistical norms. And, there is a French character that's different from an English character, and it's different from a German character, Not that every German you meet is going to be the stereotype, or every American you meet is going to be the stereotype. So the same thing with the political forms of nationalism. I think that a true, genuine American nationalism, I mean, Trump is defining it, very well in a lot of ways. It's not a kind of what German nationalism would be, right? George Orwell explored this really well. I'm saying well twice, but he explored it when he talked about, because he was a patriot, right? And I don't think he would call himself a nationalist, right? But I just believe that's a way to distance yourself from types of nationalism you don't like, right? Because essentially, I think it's the same thing. But he said you could never get the English to goose step. Right, those kind of German marches, right? That is a particularly German thing, right? You're never going to get the English to do that. Never, right? And so whatever type of British English nationalism is going to emerge, it cannot parrot German nationalism. It has to come from deep within the soul of the people and express their ideals of government, of economy, and so forth. And one of the things definitely about the United States is that it's, the whole pioneer ethos, the spirit of independence, get off my back government, that is crucial to that has to be crucial to American nationalism. And now, when you're talking about the U.S. government and a patriot not agreeing with the U.S. government, I totally agree with you. And I mean, this is what Pat Buchanan is a nationalist, right? Candidate Trump. I don't think candidate Trump would have called for the invasion of Venezuela, right? So there's something going on there. But candidate Trump was also, with you on that. He told Jeb Bush that your brother, lied. Not even a Democrat would say that. He said America has blood on its hands. Right? He, Ron Paul, he might not call himself a nationalist because of the sort of statist implications that have been associated with nationalism, but he definitely is a patriot, but he represents to me what an American nationalism would be, right, or is, and this is what Trump. I think when he made that bold statement about nationalism, I thought it was amazing, because from a long time I identified him as being a nationalist, but he just wasn't saying it because it's just not part of the vocabulary. But when he actually came out and said it, I was very impressed and pleased by it. It hasn't been articulated intellectually as yet, but we feel it, and that's one of the things about nationalism. It's the European manifestation of it, coming out of Germany, is romantic. Right? It comes out of a critique of the Enlightenment, of the universal Enlightenment ideal that we all strive to this one, utilitarian utopia of material abundance and progress and whatever, and the German counter-Enlightenment and the Romantic movement was about this particular, peculiarities of different peoples and preserving all these things, whether it be, the German folk things, and this is where the pagan stuff comes in, all the pre-Christian traditions and whatnot, and so I even forgot why I got on the topic of the romantic nationalist, but oh yeah, that you feel it, that you feel it. So there is an irrational component to it, right? There's a metaphysical, right? Irrational, I guess, is a negative way of saying it, but there's a metaphysical component to it, and definitely that's there.
So you described yourself, you say, as a Trinidad nationalist.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
So for our international audience, what does that mean to you? Like, how are you trying to push a Trinidad nationalism? And I know it's been attempted. Like, I was very impressed with your interview with the former Prime Minister Basil Pandey, and he was very much about that, trying to unite basically the two biggest working class groups at the time. It was the Africans and the East Indians and the working class at that time. So in this modern day, it's 2019, right? Yeah, 2019. Yeah. How are you championing nationalism in Trinidad and Tobago?
Right. I mean, that's a very important question, because we are a totally unique area in human civilization, right? Because I was initially inspired by Black nationalists in the United States, like Malcolm X, particularly Malcolm X, right? And they're harking back to Africa and stuff like that, and then I guess, and sort of opened me up to like Indian nationalists and stuff. And the Indian nationalist movement was incredibly important in the whole anti-colonial movements of the 20th century. And, and a lot of these nationalists, they hark back to, great civilizations, thousands of years ago. And, it's kind of this, it's very much tied into a race pride as well. So all that is there. And, at one time, in sorting through that ideas, I was wondering, I wonder, could I live in India and stuff like that? But now Trinidad is not like that, and the West Indies are not like that. 500 years at most. Christopher Columbus came in 1492, so you don't have that, and we don't have a long history. We are a new country. But Lloyd Best now, who I just, as I told you, I admire immensely, and I worked with him for so long. I remember his argument about reparations. Right? He was against the idea of seeking reparations in the modern day. And he said, listen, we have these pieces of earth. These pieces of earth are ours. What more reparations do you need than that? Right? We own countries, right? Unlike his Black brethren in the United States will never have that, right? That they are not going to own a country in the way we own this country. And not only in Trinidad and Tobago do we own a random country, we own an incredibly blessed country with oil and gas and incredible soil, and I'm sure, I am 1000% sure, there are so many resources beneath my feet right here that we have no idea about, that we have not yet tapped, right? So this is our piece of earth. My family has now been here 6 generations. We have built this country from scratch. Just like, just like the white Americans, the European Americans are not immigrants, the initial ones. Okay, yes, the Italians and Greeks later on in the 19th century, but the initial pilgrims and pioneers, they're not immigrants. They didn't immigrate to the Cherokee Nation. They didn't immigrate to, the Sioux nations and whatnot. They fought a war, they won it, and they built their own society, right? There's this Native American Republican who's now deceased and he had an online identity, I suppose an offline identity one too, called himself Bad Eagle. And his website is still up, although he's dead. Really interesting stuff. Actually, he's like an American patriot and a proud Native American, and And one of the things he said is, listen, we're a warrior people, and we lost this land in war, and we respect that. And I thought that was a great sort of line there, and I think Americans have respect for the way the Native Americans fought, right? So although it was a bloody battle and etc., but there is a real respect they have for the fight that was put up, and so now we didn't have that fight here in terms of that, but we built villages. So I can talk about in South Trinidad and my own family, there are villages built up from nothing by our people, right? And so we built these places out of the forest and made villages. We made a civilization. We made a little economy. So we've made an amazing little culture here in Trinidad, where you have people from different races from around the world brought together in this imperial project, who are now living together, but who made a country outside of that imperial project, who made a culture, who made a way of living, and it's incredibly productive. Like, for example, I don't know of anywhere else in the world. Well, I can't say in the world. That's not, let me say. Trinidad Christmas is an amazing thing. You can go up and down the Caribbean and you won't find a similar thing. You can go to Canada and you won't find a similar thing. You can go to other countries. We have our own music. We have our own food. We have our own drinks. We have our own, not only one type of Christmas song. We have now like maybe 5 or 6 different subgenres of Trinidadian Christmas song, of parang, soca parang, and these sorts of things. Soca chutney parang, and these and their particular Christmas song. And you won't only find it in that. For example, in the 19th century, we have a Roman Catholic church in the south of the island in a small village called Siparia, and there's a story about a black Madonna, a black Virgin Mary, taken up from the Spanish mainland to this church. And maybe it was the Amerindians, we say Amerindians here, the Amerindians who brought it or carved it or something from South America and brought it to Trinidad. And they believed it had these sort of magical healing powers and fertility powers. Now, when the indentured Indians came here, the Hindus from India, and which are my ancestors, came to Trinidad, they saw that statue, heard of its powers, and went to it. And they saw that statue as being a manifestation of a black goddess that the Hindus worship called Kali. Now, the Catholic Church in Trinidad started to allow the Hindus to worship this black Madonna as Kali, as a Hindu goddess, on the church ground, in the church grounds, every Holy Thursday, right? So to this day, so for 160 years, on Holy Thursday, all the Hindus go down to this place and they give sewa, which is a kind of charity donation to the poor. So a whole bunch of poor people come because they're getting all these things from the Hindu devotees, and then people are praying for children, and they're doing these what you call mundan sanskars, the baby's first shaving of the head. So all these ritualistic things done on the Roman Catholic Church grounds. I don't think any place else in the world has something like that. Especially Catholicism in the old style, particularly, is very strict about pagan worship and all this sort of stuff. But in Trinidad, for some reason, the Catholic Church ignored that and allowed it to come through. And these are just some examples of this incredible culture we have built in this place. And that's produced amazing people like V.S. Naipaul and James and Williams. And so my nationalism, right, and my book is called Politics in a Half-Made Society, right? And I'm building upon Naipaul's idea of the half-made society. We are a society in formation. We are an unfinished society, right? So the kind of nationalism I'm talking about here is not harking back to something old that we have to restore. It's about something that we are in the process of building, and that we own this place, right? Nobody can kick us out of here, right? We can't be deported from here, right? This is our place that fits our souls. You know, it just fits us. The kind of crazy madness that's part of normal Trinidad life. You know, we can do it here comfortably with ease in a way that might not fit in too well in other countries. You know,
quite right, quite right.
So that's what I mean by Trinidadian nationalism. I'm not making up some thing in the past like some of these absurd black nationalists might say about the Egyptian pyramids, and you know, there are some really absurd claims made sometimes, and I'm not doing that. I'm saying, listen, we are in the middle of making something here. We have inherited the space. We have built it. There is something very special that we have here and that we are building, and that we need to finish it. This is our project. This is our legacy. And we can build something great here. These are human scale societies, face-to-face societies. Unlike huge metropolises of 7 million people where everybody's just a number, the quality of life here, your interaction with nature, all sorts of things. It's so that's what I'm harking to.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Are you going to make Trinidad great again, or at least just make it great the first time?
Exactly. I hope so. I really do hope so. That's what I want to do. You know,
I share your passion for that, my friend. I wish you all the success. I tried it at one point. I had different issues.
Yeah.
But I'm sure you'll have a lot more success than I did.
Well, you know, one of the things, Brooke, is that all the independents, all the political leaders that we have been born during colonialism, right? And they're about to die. The fact is that, you know, that is just the truth. That those generations of politicians, they are on their last legs physically. And that a new generation is going to have to take over. And when our generation comes, we will be the first generation born during independence. That makes a difference, you know. And I think, I don't think all is lost like many people do, and they just want to get the hell out and go and whatever. But I think that leads to its own set of problems, because I lived the life of an immigrant before, and there's a lot which I do not recommend to it. I love visiting. I love visiting the countries. I love the countries for what they are, and there are many things that exist there that will never exist here, for sure. And so that's great, but you know, we have our place here. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Now it's interesting because Trinidad and Tobago's nationalism is very similar, I think, in some ways to Taiwan's nationalism. I don't know if you know, Kirk, I'm on my mother's side, I'm from Taiwan. So I wasn't born there, but I was born here in Minnesota. So, but the nationalism that they have there is very similar, because independence only really depends on who you ask. I mean, you know, for all the reasons that matter, Taiwan has been independent for just over 100 years, I'd say. It's been.
Sorry, I since when?
It's tough to, because we have different ways of looking at it. Huh?
Would you say 1949?
Probably. It depends, because we have there's different ways. Here in the US, we typically use, I mean, just, you know, the Gregorian calendar, the year is 2019.
Right.
Official documents, a lot of official, like, receipts that you get at a convenience store or anything you get in Taiwan will say it is, what is it they call it? It is the Republic of China year 100 something. I don't know what it is at right now. But there was like a little way.
Oh, so they go back to the nationalists in 1920, not like 1920 something, right? Chiang Kai-shek. No, is it? Yeah. No, it's before Chiang Kai-shek, isn't it?
Sun Yat-sen.
Yeah, Sun Yat-sen. Oh, so That's very interesting. I didn't know that. That's amazing. I'm very interested in that whole
Yeah,
that
so we
whole
would
history there, and I didn't know that. Interesting.
because we would say, you know, the Republic of China year, whatever
Yes.
year, which was
Yes.
but we still, I mean, it still follows the Gregorian calendar. It's not like
Mhm.
we're going by lunar years or anything.
Yeah.
Although some calendars you can buy in Taiwan, you'll still get your lunar calendar next to your regular calendar for like Chinese New Year purposes.
Right. Exactly.
But yeah, that's so with them, for all reasons that matter, Taiwan is an independent nation, but there's been a at least when I grew up there, so through the late 90s into the early 2000s, I was there for about 8 years. There was a bit of a, like, I mean, there was people that were proud to basically say we're Taiwanese.
Right. Now, can I ask you something?
Yep.
Is your family, did they come from the mainland after the communist takeover, or are they
Yes.
native Formosans, or?
No, so my grandmother, my mom's side is the Taiwanese side. My father is from here in the States. So
Okay.
my mom's side, her mother, my grandmother, was the oldest of 12,
Mhm.
and they escaped during that time, during the Civil War there. So between the
Were
nationalists
they
and
just civilians, or were they involved in?
we have a handful of like an extended family that did serve like in fighting the communists.
Yeah.
We also do have some relatives that still live in the mainland.
Right.
Um,
It's kind of like the Korean situation where you have families broken
yeah,
up.
not much of a DMZ though.
Right.
But yeah, growing up, there was this huge movement to kind of say, we're Taiwanese, we're not Chinese.
Right.
My mother would tell me even, I kind of joked with, we had a guest on, and I told him, I said, my mom is kind of like a Taiwanese Alex Jones light. Like everything she talked about China was always like it sounded like a conspiracy theory, but most of the time she was onto something. So,
and Alex Jones is all into the communist Chinese now. So
yeah. I mean, I would, so for example, she talked about, the Beijing Olympics back in 2008. She said, do you know why, if you look in the stands were never completely full at any event? She said, do you know why? And I'm like, well, I don't know. People don't care. She goes, no, the communists bought out 2/3 of the tickets, so you wouldn't have a crowd form, so you wouldn't have another Tiananmen Square on national TV, watched by the world. Oh, okay. It was just things like that. But she would, I personally have never been to China, but I do, just as a general rule, if I ever went to China and people asked, where I'm from, if they know me, I'd be like, oh, I'm an American. I would never say that I'm, well, my mother's from Taiwan. I live there.
Yeah.
What would happen, Amos, if you said that? That's piqued my interest now.
It's just kind of like, it'd be like if a South Korean snuck into North Korea and
said they're from the South.
Yeah.
Right. You might disappear somewhere.
I mean, I probably, the chance is pretty low because I'm also an American citizen.
Right.
So, but it couldn't go so well. Like one thing.
What's fascinating about that situation?
What's that?
I was saying what's fascinating is that the civil, and people don't realize it in the rest of the world, that the Civil War is still going on. I mean, it's
very much so.
Yeah, it's like, you used to see these old movies like in the States where these American movies where they'd find some guy on an island in the Pacific and he thinks the World War II hasn't ended yet. But I mean, very much so. Taiwan is an island like that. It's not what they think. It actually hasn't ended, and people don't realize that. Just like in Korea, in China, it's the same thing.
Well, in Korea, they officially signed it to end it, though, didn't they?
Yeah,
I think it was just a ceasefire. Yeah, but but they haven't agreed who's won.
I do, some of the listeners on this, I do a weekly article for a website doing like a news roundup kind of from a libertarian perspective of Asia. And one of the things that I found out was apparently around the Chinese New Year. So China released the China, what is it, the Chinese Liberation Army or People's Liberation Army,
Yeah,
their
PLA.
army. They released a video. It was basically footage of Taiwanese landscapes and scenery juxtaposed with Chinese bombers and planes and tanks, with a
Right.
nice little song in the background, basically speaking of like sort of like long lost brothers
Yeah.
that should return.
Yeah.
And I was like, whoa. And then the Taiwan put out a video right away in response saying the Taiwanese military is ready 24/7 even during Chinese New Year. It was just like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh. And it's this video. It's like they're not actually saying like what they're saying, but it's all kind of subtle.
Yeah.
And and then there was the article then goes into saying how like Chinese kind of considers Taiwan's independence to be just a dead end and they should just come back. They don't really admit that there is independence when for all the reasons it really is independent.
Yeah. I mean, but there is a political party there in Taiwan that is for closer relations with China now, isn't it? There's like a divide between the Kuomintang and these parties that want more.
Right. So it's funny. So
cordial relations, right?
In Chinese I'm not to correct you, but the Kuomintang literally means Kuoming means the people.
Right.
Actually means it could mean nationalism. So like the Nationalist Party is what Kuomintang, that's what that means, is Nationalist Party. They're still very, very much just sort of the interests of Taiwan, whereas the other parties, I haven't kept up in a while, but basically they want to sort of alleviate tensions by opening up, trade routes, flight routes, because there is no direct way to fly to China. There is no direct trade. It's always kind of there's a roundabout way there's a roundabout way through intermediaries through.
Is it through Hong Kong and Macau or something, or totally?
It's something. I mean, there are those aspects. It's kind of like so U.S. citizens from the U.S. cannot fly directly to Havana, Cuba.
Right.
But if I go to Mexico, I buy a one-way ticket to Mexico and a one-way ticket to Havana. That's totally fine.
Yeah.
It's similar
with trade.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. I mean, they've recently opened up some trades in the last few years, and but there's still obviously like military tensions. Growing up, I tell people about air raid drills where we have to go into the basement of our schools, and they play a nice little soundtrack of planes flying over, bombing the area.
Right.
I would
be ready.
Exactly.
Be ready. Would you like to know more?
Exactly. Or just on mainstream radio, hearing about like military intelligence sharing with the people. Hey, just so you know, there's 500 missiles aimed right at the island, ready to go. So it's
kind of like when I was growing up in the 80s, the whole thing about nuclear war, that the world is going to end, like that was very much in our minds, when Reagan and so like so sometimes I would think, oh my God, like there'd be an announcement, and I got so pumped with fear about this stuff. I was like, oh my God, is this the end? Yeah, but yeah, yours is even a more close than that. Yeah.
Some of the nationalist movements have kind of had little bits that kind of it's even made its way here to the U.S. So there was an online campaign. There was a YouTube video that was being circulated amongst a lot of Taiwanese residents in the U.S. saying, for the longest time, the census has always been, has the list of nationalities. And most people will either just say like other or other something, and when they're in the Asian, when there's stating their Asian ethnicity. And there was this whole move to say, fill in other as Taiwanese.
Right.
So circle other, fill in Taiwanese. Because the census couldn't actually, just being as an extension of the U.S. government, the U.S. government cannot officially recognize Taiwan.
Right.
Although there is something that
before 72 they did. But
right.
Yeah,
now
it was
it was
Kissinger.
Right. It was the whole, who is the real China? And now when I was there, I could still go to a building that was similar to an embassy. It's a barracks. And it's a building. We go in, it's American flags, American construction, Americans working in there, and you get your passport, anything you needed like a regular embassy without actually being called an embassy.
Right.
So,
and I guess, how about in America? Is there a Taiwanese embassy similar?
That's a good question.
I don't know, actually.
That's a good question.
I mean, one thing that I do know, I mean, America has sold Taiwan plenty of military assets.
Yeah.
It's America and the French are the two main suppliers of like Taiwanese military assets. Taiwan doesn't have any nukes. Which is
at least to the best of your knowledge.
Yeah. Probably has a very good arrangement with its friends.
and it's a very tricky thing sometimes when I do consider myself primarily like, I am an American, but it was tricky, especially around the time of Trump, as at least so when he was president-elect before the inauguration, Trump flew over to Taiwan and met with the at the time Madam President of Taiwan. And a lot of my friends on Facebook, both left and right, were kind of like, what is he doing? What is he doing meeting with Taiwan with all the tensions we have with China? And I was like on one hand, I get it. Yeah, you don't want to raise tensions. Yeah. On the other hand, I'm like, yeah, Taiwan,
Yeah. But what's really fascinating about this is that your idea of nationalism is in a totally different context, and it's not that one is less valid than the other, but it's really interesting because you are speaking now here between the battle between the nationalists and the communists that was happening in the 1940s, and then I suppose because it's interesting that year one, you're talking about year one, so that's also the nationalists versus the emperor, right? So I mean, so it was against the
there isn't. I mean, you definitely don't have.
You don't
any sentiments to go back to an empire.
But that's what Sun Yat-sen was against the Chinese emperor, right? So wanted to make a republic, a modern Chinese nationalist republic, and then when the communists came later, then he was fighting the communists because I guess they succeeded against the old. But so it's interesting. So nationalism in your context is quite different from because whereas what I'm talking about is this sort of nascent thing and making a nation. Here you're talking about a 5,000-year-old at least nation. Then because I've always been interested in this, like the rise of nationalism in, let's say, Africa or even Europe or just old societies. Because let's say South African nationalists, right? What I find interesting, is let's just say African, not particularly South African, African. So if you had a society before with its own sort of laws and history and culture and whatnot, the nationalists of the 19th and 20th century did not want to go back and restore that. Right? They did not want to be. They wanted to be independent, but they did not want to go back to the old system. So there's a kind of modernizing nationalism. And that's, I think, very much what if I can forgive my mangling of the pronunciation, Kuomintang, I think, but that's what the I'll say KMT then.
Yeah, that works too.
Yeah, the KMT was they were a modernizing force, where nationalism, within this 5,000-year history, nationalism is a modernizing force. And then also in your context, an anti-communist force. So which is very different from our context. So I can understand how using the same word for both those concepts can be a bit confusing, I suppose, because you're definitely coming at it from a very specific position that is quite different from mine, and very complex and multi-layered. Yeah. So it's fascinating.
And it's interesting too. The nationalist party in Taiwan, so Taiwan is, I mean, I consider it to be very socialized. It might as well just be a very socialist country, although it's more on the degree of like socialist, sort of like the Nordic countries. Although it's probably not run as well, especially in the healthcare system.
Let me ask you something, if you could elaborate on this for me, because one of the things that's also part of my specialty and studies is international development studies, and so growing of economies and societies throughout the developing world. And in the 80s, the whole NICs. Are you familiar with that term? The newly industrializing countries. So it was like,
I don't.
Right. So in the 80s, you had this phenomenon of NICs that used to be talked about a lot, and they called it the Asian miracle. So they would point to China, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and then to a lesser extent later Malaysia, and then Indonesia, they talked about this, I can't remember, some goose shape or duck shape, something V formation kind of, right? But yeah, so Taiwan was touted, it was touted by the right wing as a capitalist model for success. So by neoliberals, I won't say right wing, right? So this was the neoliberal story, right? Because all these countries adopted, they welcomed foreign direct investment. They didn't cut themselves off like Latin America or Africa, and wanted to be autarkic. So these countries were, held up by the neoliberals as being, bastions of global capitalism. So it's very interesting for me to hear you saying that Taiwan is more like the Nordic country. Is there some way you can
the Nordic countries? So the whole misnomer with American politics is everyone kind of pushed that, the Nordic countries, those are like perfect socialist successes, when in reality they're just highly capitalistic market economies with huge social programs like healthcare, welfare, and so on, which are being destabilized by by the migrant issue they have.
Yep.
In Taiwan, you have similar problems, but I think it's tricky to see, because I never really got too much into like well-informed on sort of the budgetary issues that might be going on with the with the Taiwan economy, but I just know that the healthcare system there, because it was a lot more densely populated, so it's the island of Taiwan has about 24 million people. Mm-hmm. And if you kind of do some quick math, you can kind of figure. So the state of Minnesota, I think, is actually the U.S. has about 320 million.
Right.
If Taiwan's population density was flipped with the U.S., it was in the billions, probably.
Right. Yeah.
So you basically have this small, densely populated country that is very capitalistic, but because it's so packed in, and there's a huge contrast between, you go into the city and it's like top of the line first world nation. You think you're in a first world country.
Yeah.
You go a few miles outside of town.
I want to see the future. Yeah, Asia is the future. If you want to see, like, yeah, not America or anything. If it's when you go to those countries, you see like all this like robots and high speed rail and all this kind of.
Oh yeah, it was
yeah.
it was a very weird thing that I could be. So for example, cell phone coverage is huge in Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
I had my phone and I went into Taiwan, and my network provider basically gave me free coverage in the area. I could pay to get higher speeds, but I could get a general sort of data package just included. I was in the middle of the mountains, able to still send pictures on Facebook, message people. Here in the US, that would be unheard of. Like if you're in the mountains, you're screwed.
Mm-hmm.
But there were cell phone towers in the mountains.
Yeah.
And around me is third world, but the infrastructure in place was top of the line first world. So you have this huge, difference between the cities and these villages. You could have villages where everyone's got iPhones. Villages where where houses and buildings are built out of tin and wood, and it's or just raw, just concrete, no real structural integrity. The moment an earthquake hits, the whole town, the whole village crumbles. But everyone's got smartphones, and the floor is dirty, the everything's old.
But one thing I want to ask about that too is that also a division between the native Formosans and the mainland Chinese that fled after?
Not so much. I mean, there definitely is a division. Like if you see native, so the native Taiwanese, the Aboriginals, we talk about there's the 10 major tribes that are there.
And when you say tribes, do they live in forests, or are they villagers, peasants, or what?
It's very much like the American reservations in terms of, but they're more integrated into, like they celebrate their culture, but they're not.
But were they hunters and gatherers or farmers?
I think there were farmers. There were more farmers because there were more farmers because of they're basically, you look at their culture, you look at the way they dress, even just how they look, they don't look too different from Chinese,
right?
Because you figure they look very Han, like at characteristics. Their culture is they still have rice, they use bamboo. A lot of the colors and the cultural things they do, it's very similar to Chinese. It's just, you can kind of see it's deviated off because you figure,
are they considered Han or not?
No. Although, they're still they're both, like here, seeing a Native American, you actually have to go somewhere to see them. There, you can see them all around. Around in day-to-day life, although probably not as many. And people will go to their sort of these villages they have to participate in any cultural events they're celebrating, and you can kind of get to see what they're doing.
So is it rare that they participate in urban life, just as the way Native Americans
pretty rare.
aren't?
I would say it's pretty rare. I mean, it's not. I mean, here in the U.S., you have a huge different variety of Native American participation. So you have anything from so like northern Minnesota has a lot of small reservation kind of communities, and it's just, unfortunately, it's run down by it's trailer homes, and
alcohol problems and stuff like that.
I mean, the only business that the Native Americans are really running is maybe the gas station and
casinos.
Well, I'm just saying up north,
but not in Minnesota.
But then,
on the other end.
On the other end, yes, you drive half an hour away from where I live, and it is the largest casino in Minnesota, probably in the Midwest. I think, depending upon who you talk to.
I visited actually.
Where Mystic Lake.
Yeah. My sister-in-law lives up in Minnesota, so yeah.
Mystic Lake Casino is just constantly expanding. They've got spotlights outside, all these, and it's super, huge hotel complex.
Vegas light.
It's the whole thing. It's constantly growing. I've come across different people who've talked about, we're expanding the parking lot, we're building a whole new wing of rooms. And
there's this one hilarious reaction to that. But I remember Michael Palin saying that's the biggest goddamn teepee I've ever seen.
But in Taiwan, the Aboriginals are really just more so. They have their own culture. They're very much, they can preserve that. I'm guess from, because I've seen, they'll also they'll sell sort of knickknacks and trinkets at local sort of tourist areas. So you'll have there's this really famous sort of market area that I went to growing up. It's pretty much like a long stairway going up a mountain with stores on the left and right. So you're walking up a market.
Yeah.
So cool. It's like you walk. Go ahead.
I have a story where I was driving around because I was impressed with this whole thing, because the whole transformation of the reservation that the casino has done economically is quite fascinating. And then it's interesting the way that they try to use the casino to preserve their ancient heritage and stuff like that. So I was actually driving around a bit, looking at the houses, really big houses, and no fencing. It's because they're a community, right? So safety, so they're totally safe and whatnot with each other. And I was taking pictures. Well, who told me to take pictures? because then we were driving out, some insane car just cut us off, stop, and some woman just is coming on. She's like a mad woman. What the hell are you taking these pictures for? Who are you with? Who are you? Right? And I don't know, she thought it was some government thing, or I have no idea. And she was just going insane on me. I was like, it's like I'm gonna start a war or something.
That's a whole problem unto itself. So you saw very nice houses. A lot of them aren't very well preserved, though. So there's a divide among the native population. So once they all reach a certain age, usually 18, they reach 18, they get a profit share of the tribes.
Some
tribes do that. Yeah. And then there's certain conditions that have to be met. Like if you're a full blood half, I think it's like 1/16 is the smallest you get. You get a take of the profits. Well, used to be, until very recently, where you would just get a lump sum.
That sounds racist.
You would get
biggest
a lump
mutual
sum.
aid society you've ever seen.
Exactly. Yeah. You would get a lump sum of anywhere in a few $100,000, probably $750,000, anywhere upwards of a few million, depending upon all sorts of circumstances. And so what are typically at 18? Yeah. So I worked with someone here in the area who had a classmate who was a Native American, and on his 18th birthday, he took his two friends with him, one of these guys I was working with, and they went to the dealership and bought 3 Hummers, one of each color. And he basically had a backpack full of cash, and he dumped it on the table, said, I'm going to take these 3. He signed all the paperwork, gave him all the keys, and he said, all right, we're driving them back.
At 18.
At 18, yeah.
He had that plan. He definitely had that plan.
Yeah, and so you had a lot of these problems where people would buy decent sized houses, and they just fill their it's very much, you can tell, because I've been in some of these houses, you can see they're built and they're decorated in such a way as someone who has a lot of money but no real planning or
taste.
or taste.
Yeah, that's what you're looking for. Is a sense of style is what's
yeah, there's
missing.
no style. You walk in, you see like, okay, you see what the house is, and then you see all the decorations, and it's just, let me fill this house with as many Native American artifacts, decorations, paintings, whatever, all over the place. So it just looks like it just doesn't quite match. There's no modern.
Yeah,
there's a way you can kind of show your culture and have a bit of taste, but it was just kind of filled with like, you bought whatever you saw at some store and you just filled up your house.
Yeah,
and these houses
made in China or even Taiwan.
These houses would have 10 to 12 rooms, and it's owned by one person, and it's really just a place for that person's friends who are also Native Americans, who maybe are don't have as much money anymore, that are just crashing because they're hungover, drunk, high, or whatever. And it's just kind of a mess. Nowadays, they have started to break down the payments they give out to the recipients. So I was a manager at a restaurant at one point, and I had an employee who was a high school student, and she quit just before she turned 18 because she was 1/16 Native American. And so she quit, and 1 month later, I see her like driving around the area in a brand new car. And some people kind of explained it to me like, oh, well, nowadays what they do is like when you're turning 18, you get like $50,000. But before you get that, you have to meet with like a financial advisor. You go through a class, kind of teach you how to be financially responsible. Some purchases you can make on your own. Some you have to go through your financial advisor, and
make sure the bank steals it from you instead.
As time goes on,
the middleman needs his cut.
Right. As time goes on, you get little bits of the lump sum. You're not getting it all at once. You're kind of learning, and they're making sure you're at least responsible enough, or at least educated to know how to spend your money. So you can get yourself a car, but we're not going to give you so much that you can go buy a house now.
Yeah,
so
it's probably smart. I mean, even in Trinidad, because we've had the oil and gas in Trinidad.
Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of that money has gone for infrastructure and other things like that. But what set like you would remember, Kirk, about Vision 2020 from
I was on it. I was
I think I may have remembered you on that. Because we were trying to compare ourselves to the Singapore and how they had a miraculous transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it had to do with exactly what Amos is talking about, that financial education.
Yeah.
And it was the work ethic and all these other kinds of things that really brought that change. Yeah. And I mean, to hear Amos share the story, obviously the Indian nation is trying to adopt that same model,
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the big problem though with the Native American communities is, and this can be controversial depending upon who you ask, but as much as your more left-leaning professors or schools of thought will try to push like, we killed them all, they're dying out, and we're just, the injustices of the past and such. A majority of the a huge part of the problem, I think it's the majority of the problem, is caused by the fact that Native Americans marry outside the tribe. So I mentioned how you have these like half, quarter, eighth, and 16th Native Americans. Why would you have 1/16 Native Americans? Like in a case where you'd think like the tribe would want to kind of preserve their group, but I think some study I read somewhere like 80 or 90% of the population, like of the problem of the sort of dwindling population of Native Americans, is through just marrying out.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know. I also think, that, the Native Americans, I mean, they had a foraging lifestyle, hunting and gathering mainly. They weren't generally a sedentary people. The big, peoples in the Americas that built, cities and stable, urban civilizations were in, were the Mexicans, the Mayas, the Incas in the south, but the rest of the people were basically a forest kind of people, and hunting and nomads and following the bison or the deer or the elk or the caribou or wherever they would be located, or the salmon and the coast and stuff like that. And that they didn't have cash economies. They are so culturally, the money economy is, still kind of new to them. I mean, and in my podcast, interestingly, on paganism, we spoke about that because the author, Christopher McIntosh, used to work with the UNDP, which was interesting. And then he sort of moved. It actually made him more sensitive and willing to embrace his pre-Christian pagan past, because he was saying this in the Kalahari Bushmen, for example. They have a life expectancy in, I don't know, the 40s or 50s, something really low. They are facing, I suppose, they only eat when they hunt, right? So they're kind of almost always on the brink of starvation, in a sense. They have hardly any material goods to think of, and so they would be considered to be extremely poor people that need saving, right? Now, however, when you save them and you put them in a suit and tie and put them in a city and give them a job, they get depressed and they become alcoholics, right? They lost their connection to the, so whatever material poverty they had, there was a whole world there of meaning that was important to them. And then when you took them out and just gave them all the material things, it spiritually crushed them. And so you have these serious payoffs there. And I think that, when I was growing up in Canada too, right? So I was inspired by all this like civil rights stuff with the African Americans, and then of course you had in the 80s you had these Sandinistas and FMLN in El Salvador and all this kind of Marxist groups, and I still like all that stuff, and so I was all into that, and sometimes you'd see the Native Americans protesting here and there and stuff, but I would wonder, I would say, what are they protesting about, really? I mean, my family are immigrants, and there's no discrimination in Canada. They could just come to any city, take a job, and partake in the modern world without any hindrance whatsoever. I didn't understand what their issues were, really, and I said, why would you want to live on the reservation? And I really could not understand it until I sort of got into the kind of cultural nationalism, the cultural nationalist part of it, and then it sort of hit me, and I said, oh, now I understand that they can't be bought, that material stuff is not what they want. They want to maintain their peoplehood and their traditions, and if it means they have, a lower human development index ranking or whatever, that's fine, because that's not what they're about, and I think it has a lot to do with that, in my view.
Excellent. I would agree with that. I mean, it's even for Trinidadians like myself and those, that have traveled. Anytime we hear Caribbean music, for instance, there's something that kind of perks us up. Right, like just this weekend, I was out at a public market. I can't even remember where it was, and there was a African gentleman there on the DJ set, and I just looked at how he was dancing, for instance, and it's like, that man is from the Caribbean.
Yeah,
and he was from Dominica, right? I went up and I had a chat with him, and walking past him, another guy's like, "You're Jamaican," and he's like, "Yeah, I'm from Trinidad," and But as you say, that cultural side, it does unite a people.
Yeah.
Like we have the issue in Trinidad right now with the Venezuelan crisis, and we got a lot of Venezuelan refugees. We don't really have refugee laws per se, and it's good. But you're seeing that in the music. So the music that we have now is that they're starting to integrate a lot of Spanish and all of these different types of things, which is fine. We've always had a good relationship. Our Christmas music and such. And I guess what the point I was making on that is, there is a place for that, but at the same time, Trinidad does have its unique culture.
Absolutely. And we have to preserve it.
Which is the point I was about to make, that if it's a small country, it's 1.3 million people, if just another million Venezuelans decided to show up into Trinidad, it would completely change the dynamic of the country.
That's right. I mean, and this is why I have sympathy for American nationalists. Like, so in Trinidad, so if 300,000 Venezuelans come here and demand that schools start teaching in Spanish and that everything has to also be in Spanish, and I mean, I wouldn't want to change to change our country for that. I mean, we have a country here, and we have our culture, and we have a right to preserve it. I think, and this is what I would call nationalist. People believe they have a right to preserve their national heritage, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that is being demonized all over the world, right? Especially in white countries. For some reason, other countries, right? People don't have a problem with China being Chinese. Well, or people do have a problem with Taiwan. Unfortunately, there's about 1 billion people that have a problem. But they don't have a problem with Africa. African countries being African, or but for some reason, Britain being British, or Sweden being Swedish, or France being French, or America being American is seen as a problem, and especially for us in other parts of the world where we are nationalistic, it's totally hypocritical to deny those same human rights, I guess you could call them, to others. And so, yeah, I agree with that.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, anything else you wanted to add, Brook?
I think we're coming up on time. Kirk, man, you're amazing. We always have a good conversation. This could have very well gone on for like another hour at least.
Absolutely, yeah, I know.
So again, we just want to advise, we got some people in the chat, and so hi to everyone there. Please do subscribe to Kirk's podcast, and I look forward to future chats with you, my friend.
Yeah, me too. And and you're going to be coming up on my show. It's either going to be this week or next week. I'll make the announcement and I'll let you know definitely. But yeah, that was a great conversation we had too.
Yeah. But yeah, all the links to Kirk's podcast and his social media are all below. Definitely check that out. Also check out, of course, other episodes we've had here on the podcast. Subscribe to the channel, click on the like button, and subscribe to Brook's channel. He is 2 subscribers away from 1,000. Trying to get him there. Once you get there, things will get crazy. So
yeah, I get monetized.
Yeah. For all those controversial videos that they're going to monetize, right? But yeah, check out our other episodes on here. Check us out on iTunes as well. And check out, of course, we have a Subscribe Star and a Patreon as well, if anyone is interested in supporting the content. We're completely self-funded, and we are, that's what we do. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Kirk, once again for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah. And we're not sure what we're doing next week, but we will be on, of course, next week, Sunday at 11 o'clock Central Time in the morning. Yeah, we will see everyone next week.
Thanks for watching, everyone.